in resuming, Does Jesus Associate with the Disinherited, Part 6, from Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. My subject, which has been a continuation, this is the 6th part of Does Jesus Associate with the Disinherited? We will go on to say, Howard Thurman will go on to say, was it against the background of his heritage and his religious faith in the 138th song that Jesus assumed his great ethical imperative? This seems to be conclusively brought out in his treatment of the climax of human history. The judge is on his throne, the sheep are on the right, and the goats are on the left. The judge speaks, I was a hungered, and ye gave me no meat, sick and in prison, and ye visited me not. The climax of human history is interpreted as a time when the inner significance of men's deeds would be revealed to them. But here a new note is introduced. Sincerity in human relations is equal to and the same as sincerity to God. If we accept this explanation as a clue to Jesus' meaning, we come upon the stark fact that the insistence of Jesus upon genuineness is absolute. Man's relation to man and man's relation to God are one relation. A death blow is struck to hypocrisy. One of the major defense mechanisms of the disinherited is taken away from them. What does Jesus give them in its place? What does he substitute for hypocrisy? Sincerity. But is sincerity a mechanism of defense against the strong? I would say not. The answer is no. Something more significant takes place. In the presence of an overwhelming sincerity on the part of the disinherited, the dominant themselves are caught with no defense, with the edge taken away from the sense of prerogative and from the status upon which the impregnability of their position rests. They are thrown back upon themselves for their rating. The experience of power has no meaning aside from the other than self-reference which sustains it. If the position of ascendancy is not acknowledged tactically and actively by those over whom the ascendancy is exercised, then it falls flat. Hypocrisy on the part of the disinherited in dealing with the dominant group is a tribute yielded by those who are weak. But if this attitude is lacking or is supplanted by a simple sincerity and genuineness, then it follows that advantage due to the accident of birth or position is reduced to zero. Instead of relation between the weak and the strong, there is merely a relationship between human beings. A man is a man, no more, no less. The awareness of this fact marks the supreme moment of human dignity. Chapter 4, Hate. Hate is another of the hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the disinherited in seasons and out of seasons. During times of war, hatred becomes quite respectable, even though it has to masquerade often under the guise of patriotism. Yes, we see this taking place right today in our country. To even the casual observer during the last war, it was obvious that the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese gave many persons in our country an apparent justification for indulging all of their anti-colored feelings. In a Chicago cab en route to the University of Inglewood, this fact was dramatized for me. The cab had stopped for a red light. Apropos of no conversation, the driver turned to me and saying, "Who do they think they are? Those little yellow dogs. They think they can do that to white men and get away with it." During the early days of the war, I noticed a definite rise in rudeness and overt expressions of color prejudice, especially in trains and other public conveyances. It was very simple. Hatred could be brought out into the open. We see that happening with the insurrection and the Make America Great Again. A wink to the white supremacists. It says here, hatred could be brought out into the open, given a form of dignity and a place of respectability. But for the most part, we are not vocal about our hatred. Hating is something of which to be ashamed unless it provides for us a form of validation and prestige. If either is provided, then the immoral or amoral character of the hatred is transformed into positive violence. Christianity has been almost sentimental in its effort to deal with hatred in human life. It has sought to get rid of hatred by preachments, by moralizing, by plaintive judgment. It has hesitated to analyze the basis of hatred and to evaluate in the terms of its possible significance in the lives of people possessed by it. This reluctance to examine hatred has taken on the character of a superstition. It is a subject that is taboo unless there is some extraordinary social crisis, such as war, involving the mobilization of all the national resources of the common life to meet it. There is a conspiracy of silence about hatred, its function and its meaning. Hatred cannot be defined. It can only be described. If I were to project a simple diagram of hatred revealing the anatomy of its development, the idea would break down as follows. In the first place, hatred often begins in a situation in which there is contact without fellowship. Contact that is devoid of any of the primary overtures of warmth and fellow feeling and genuineness. Of course, it must be borne in mind that there can be an abundance of sentimentality masquerading under the cloak of fellowship. It is easy to have fellowship on our own terms and to repudiate it if your terms are not acceptable. It is this kind of fellowship that one finds often in the South between whites and Negroes. Thurman goes on to say, as long as the Negro is called John or Mary and accepts the profoundly humiliating position of an inferior status, fellowship is quite possible. Great sacrifices are even made for him, and all the weight of position and power are at the disposal of the weaker person. It is precisely because of this false basis of fellowship, so often found that in the section of the country where there is the greatest contact between Negro and white, there is the least real fellowship. And the first step along the road of bitterness and hatred is assured. When we give to the concept a wider application, it is clear that much of modern life is so impersonal that there is always opportunity for the seeds of hatred to grow unmolested. Where there are contacts devoid of genuine fellowship, such contacts stand in immediate candidacy for hatred. In second place, contacts without fellowship tend to express themselves in the kind of understanding that is strikingly unsympathetic. There is understanding of a kind, but it is without the healing and reinforcement of personality. Rather, it is like the experience of going into a man's office and in that moment before being seated, when the full gaze of the other is focused upon you, suddenly wondering whether the top button of your vest is in place, but not daring to look. In a penetrating, incisive, cold understanding, there is no cushion to absorb limitations or to provide extenuating circumstances for protection. It is a grievous blunder to assume that understanding is always sympathetic. Very often we use the phrase, I understand, to mean something kindly, warm, or gracious. But there is an understanding that is hard, cold, minute, and deadly. It is the kind of understanding that one gives to the enemy, or that is derived from an accurate knowledge of another's power to endure. There is an understanding of another's weakness which may be used as a weapon of offense or defense. Understanding that it is not the outgrowth of an essential fellow feeling is likely to be unsympathetic. Of course, there may be pity in it, even compassion sometimes, but sympathy almost never. I can sympathize only when I see myself in another's place. Unsympathetic understanding is the characteristic attitude governing the relation between the weak as well as the strong. All kinds of first aid may be rendered to the weak. They may be protected so long as there is this abject acknowledgement of their utter dependence upon the strong. When the Southern white person says, I understand the Negro, what he really means is that he has a knowledge of the Negro within the limitations of the boundaries which the white man has set up. The kind of Negro he understands has no existence except in his own mind. In third place, an unsympathetic understanding tends to express itself in the active functioning of ill will. A few years ago, Howard Thurman says, a few years ago I was going from Chicago to Memphis, Tennessee. I found a seat across from an elderly lady who took immediate cognizance of my presence. And when the conductor came along for the ticket, she said to him, pointing in my direction, "What is that doing in this car? What is that?" The conductor answered with a touch of creative humor, "That has a ticket." For the next 50 miles, this lady talked for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes with each person who was seated along in that coach, setting forth her philosophy of human relationships and the basis of her objection to my presence on the car. I was able to see the atmosphere in the entire car shift from common indifference to active recognition of, and to some extent, positive resentment of my presence, and ill will spreading its virus by contagion. In the fourth place, ill will, when traumatized in a human being, becomes hatred walking on the earth. The outline is now complete. In simple context, without fellowship, developing hatred and expressing themselves in unsympathetic understanding, and unsympathetic understanding tending to express itself in the exercise of ill will, and ill will traumatized in a man or woman, becoming hatred walking on the earth. Many analysis of hatred, it is customary to apply it only to the attitude of the strong towards the weak. The general impression is that many white people hate Negroes, that Negroes are merely the victims. Such an assumption is quite ridiculous. I was seated in a Jim Crow car which extended across the highway at a railway station in Texas. 2 Negro girls of about 14 or 15 sat behind me. One of them looked out of the window and said, "Look at those kids." She referred to 2 little white girls who were skating towards the train. "Wouldn't it be funny if they fell and spattered their brains all over the pavement?" I looked at them. Through the white torture chambers had they come, torture chambers that had so attacked the grounds of humanness in them that there was nothing capable of calling forth any appreciation or understanding of white persons. There was something that made me shiver. Hatred in the mind and spirit of the disinherited is born out of great bitterness, bitterness that is made possible by sustained resentment, which is bottled up until it distills an essence of vitality, giving to the individual in whom this is happening a radical and fundamental basis for self-realization. Let me illustrate this. Suppose you are one of 5 children in a family, and it happened again and again that if there was just enough for 4 children in any given circumstance, you were the child who had to do without. If there was money for 4 pairs of shoes and 5 pairs were needed, it was you who did without shoes. If there were 5 pieces of cake on a plate, 4 healthy slices and 1 small piece, you were given the small piece. At first, when this happened, you overlooked it because you thought that your sisters and brothers, each in his turn, would have the same experience, but they did not. Then you complained quietly to the brother who was closest to you and understanding, and he thought that you were being disloyal to your mother and father to say such a thing. In a moment of self-righteousness, you spoke to your father about it. Your father put you on the carpet so severely that you decided not to mention it again, but you kept on watching. The discrimination continued. At night, when the lights were out, you were safely tucked away in bed. You reached down into the quiet places of your little heart and lifted out your bundle of hates and resentments growing out of the family situation, and you figured them gently, one by one. In the darkness, you murmured to yourself, they can keep me from talking about it to them, but they can't keep me from resenting it. I hate them for what they are doing to me. No one can prevent me there. Hatred becomes for you a source of validation for your personality as you consider the family and the attitude towards you. Your hatred gives you a sense of significance, which you flying defiantly into the teeth of their estimate of you. In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, there is an expression of this attitude. You will doubtless recall the story. Ahab has had his leg bitten off in an encounter with the white whale. He collects a motley crew, and they sail into the northern seas to find the conquer the whale. The storm comes up at sea. Ahab stands on deck with his ivory leg fastened to the floor. He leans against the railing in utter defiance of the storm. His hair is disheveled. His face is furrowed, and there is a fever in his blood that only the conquest of the white whale can cure. In effect, he says to the lightning, you may destroy this vessel. You may dry up the bowels of the sea. You may consume me, but I can still be ashes. It is this kind of attitude that is developed in the mind and the soul of the weak and the disinherited. As they look out upon their world, they recognize at once that they are the victims of a systematic denial of the rights and privileges that are theirs, by virtue both of their being human and of their citizenship. Their acute problem is to deal with the estimate that their environment places them. For the environment, though it's power controlling and prestige bearing representatives, has announced to them that they do not rate anything other than that which is being visited upon them. If they accept this judgment, then the grounds of their self-estimate is destroyed, and their acquaintance becomes an endorsement of the judgment of the environment. Because they are despised, they despise themselves. If they reject the judgment, hatred may serve as a device for rebuilding, step by perilous step, the foundation for individual significance, so that from within the intensity of their necessity, they declare their right to exist, despite the judgment of the environment. I remember that once, when moving from one home to another, I came upon a quiet family of mice in a box in the basement. Their presence created a moral problem for me, for I did not feel that I had the right to take their lives. Then I remembered my responsibility to the family that was moving in, and with heaviness of heart, I took my daughter's little broom and descended upon them with a mighty strokes. Sensing the impending tragedy, one of them raised himself on his haunches to meet the stroke of the broom with a squeal of defiance, affirming the core of his mouse integrity in the face of descending destruction. Hatred makes this sort of profound contribution to the life of the disinherited, because it establishes the dimensions of self-realization hammered out of the raw materials of injustice. A distinct derivative from hatred's contribution to self-realization. When self-realization is established as a rallying point for the personality, it is the tremendous source of dynamic energy provided. Surplus energy is created and placed at the disposal of the individual's need and ends. In a sense, the whole personality is altered. All kinds of supports for implementing one's affirmed position are seized upon. A strange and new cunning possesses the mind, and every opportunity for taking advantage. For defeating the enemy is revealed in clear perspective. One of the salient ways by which this expresses itself is the quality of endurance that appears. It is the sort of thing that causes a little boy, when he is being overpowered by a big boy, to refrain from tears or from giving any expression that will reveal the depths of his pain and hurt. He says to himself grimly, "I'll die before I cry." I have already pointed out that relationships between the strong and the weak is characterized often by its amoral aspect. When hatred serves as a dimension of self-realization, the illustration of righteousness is easy to create. Often there are but thin lines between bitterness, hatred, self-realization, defiance, and righteous indignation. The logic of the strong-weak relationship is to place all moral judgment of behavior out of bounds. Type of behavior that, under normal circumstances, would call for self-condemnation. Can very easily, under these special circumstances, be regarded as necessary and therefore defensible. To take advantage of the strong is regarded merely as settling an account. It is open season all the time, without the operation of normal moral inhabitations. It is a form of the old lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This hatred becomes a device by which the individual seeks to protect himself against more disintegration. He does to the other human beings what he could not ordinarily do to them without losing his self-respect. This is an aspect of hatred that has almost universal application during a time of war, national crisis. Doubtless you will recall that during the last war, a very interesting defense of hatred appeared in America. The reasoning ran something like this: American boys have grown up in a culture, in a civilization in which they have absorbed certain broad attitudes of respect for human personality and other traits, characteristics of gentlemen of refinement and dignity. Therefore, they are prepared psychologically or emotionally to become human war machines, to make themselves conscious instruments of death. Something radical has to happen to their personality and their overall outlook to render them more effective tools of destruction. The most effective way by which this transformation can be brought about is through discipline in hatred. For if they hate the enemy, then that hatred will immunize them from a loss of moral self-respect, as they do to the enemy what is demanded of them in his successful persecution of the war. To use a figure, a curtain was dropped in front of their moral values and their ethical integrity as human beings and Americans. And they moved around in front of that curtain to do their death-dealing work on other human beings. The curtain of protection was the disciplined hatred. A simple illustration of what I mean is this. There are some people who cannot tell you face to face precisely what they think of you unless they get angry first. Anger serves as a protection of their finer sense of values as they look you in the eye and say things under ordinary circumstances they would not be able to say. When I was a boy, my mother occasionally found it necessary to punish me and my sister. My sister, when whipped, would look at my mother in the face, showing no visible signs of emotional reaction. This attitude caused the burden of proof to shift from her shoulders to my mother's shoulders, with the result that my mother did not whip my sister with such intensity, growing out of a self-righteous indignation as if the reaction had been otherwise. When my turn came, all the neighbors knew what was happening in the Thurman house, the Thurman family. Therefore, my mother whipped me with an attention to detail that was radically different from the experience she had with my sister. My attitude fed her indignation to the point of giving her complete immunity for self-condemnation. This is precisely what hatred does in human beings faced with hard and brutal choices in dealing with each other. It is not difficult to see how hatred, operating in this fashion, provides for the weak a basis for moral justification. Every expression of intolerance, every attitude of meaninglessness, every statute that limits and degrades gives further justification for life negation on the part of the weak toward the strong. It makes possible for an individual to be life-affirming and life-negating at one and at the same time. If a man's attitude is self-negating in his relationships with those to whom he recognizes no moral responsibility, his conduct is without condemnation in his own mind. In his relations with his fellows to whom he recognizes moral responsibility, his attitude is self-affirming. There must be within him some guarantee against contagion by the life-negating attitude, lest he lose a sense of moral integrity in all of its relationships. Hatred seems to function as such a guarantee. The oppressed can give themselves over with utter enthusiasm to life-affirming attitudes towards their fellow sufferers. This becomes compensation for their life-negating attitude toward the strong. Of course, back of this whole claim of logic is the idea that there is a fundamental justice in life upon which the human spirit in its desperation may relay. In its moral, beatific definition, it is the basis of the composure of the martyr who is being burned at the stake. He seems to be caught up in the swirl of elemental energy and power that transforms the weakness and limitations of his personality into that which makes of him a Superman being. It is clear then, for the weak, hatred seems to serve a creative purpose. It may be judged harshly by impersonal ethical standards, but as long as the weak see it as being intrinsically involved in the complicated technique of survival with dignity, It cannot easily be dislodged. Jesus understood this. What must have passed through his mind when he observed the contemptuous disregard for the Jews by the Romans whose power had closed in on Israel? What thoughts raced through his mind when Judas of Galilee raised his rallying banner of defiance, sucking into the tempest of his embittered spirit many of the sons of Judah? It is reasonable to assume that Jesus did not understand the anatomy of hatred. In the face of the obvious facts of his environment, he counseled against hatred. And his words is, love your enemies, that they may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. Why? Despite all the positive psychological attitudes of hatred we have outlined, hatred destroys finally the core of the life of the hater. While it lasts, burning in the white heat, its effect seems positive and dynamic, but at last it turns to ash, for it guarantees a final isolation from one's fellows. It blinds the individual to all values of worth, even as they apply to himself and to his fellows. Hatred bears deadly and bitter fruit. It is blind and non-discriminating. True, it begins by exercising specific discrimination. This it does by centering upon the persons responsible for the situation, which create the reaction of resentment, bitterness, and hatred. But once hatred is released, it cannot be confined to the offenders alone. It is difficult for hatred to be informed as to objects when it gets underway. I remember that when I was an undergraduate in Atlanta, Georgia, a man came in to the president's office, in which I was the errand boy. The president was busy, so the man engaged me in conversation. Eventually, he began talking about his two little boys. He said, among other things, I am rearing my boys so that they will not hate Negroes. Do not misunderstand me. I do not love them, but I am wise enough to know that if I teach my boys to hate Negroes, they will end up hating white people as well. Hatred cannot be controlled once it is set in motion. And some years ago, a medical friend of mine gave me a physical examination. After weighing me, he said, "You better watch your weight. You are getting up in years now, and your weight will have a bad effect on your vital organs." He explained this in graphic detail while he was taking a chuckle, for as I looked at him, I saw a man about 5 feet 4 inches in height, weighed 215 pounds. My friend the doctor thought his body knew that he was a doctor, but his body did not know he was a doctor. The only thing it knew was that he was accumulating more energy through his food than his body was able to consume. Hence, his body did precisely what mine was doing. It stored energy in the form of fat. Hatred is like that. It does not know anything about the pressures exerted upon the weak by the strong. It knows nothing about the extenuating circumstances growing out of a period of national crisis, making it seemingly necessary to discipline men in hatred of other human beings. The terrible truth remains. The logic of the development of hatred is death to the spirit and disintegration of ethical and moral values. Above and beyond all else, it must be borne in mind that hatred tends to dry up the springs of creative thought in the life of the hater, so that his resourcefulness becomes completely focused on the negative aspects of his environment. The urgent needs of the personalities for creative expression are starved to death. A man's horizon may become so completely dominated by the intense chapter of his hatred that there remains no creative residue in his mind and spirit to give to great ideas, to great concepts. He becomes lopsided. To use the phrase Zarathustra, he becomes a cripple in reverse. Jesus rejected hatred. It was not because he lacked the vitality or the strength. It was not because he lacked the insensitive. Jesus rejected hatred because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, death to the communion with his Father. He affirmed life, and hatred was the great denial. To him it was clear, thou must not make division, that thy mind, heart, soul, and strength must ever search to find the way by which the road to all men's needs of thee must go. This is the highway of the Lord. We're going to end right there. We will pick up with chapter 5. Thank you for viewing this video. Please subscribe to my channel, and we will continue next week on part 7 of Does Jesus Associate with the Disinherited? God bless you. May God keep you. Our ministry video on my website by way of YouTube. Please join us every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. where we will tackle questions concerning life in general from a Christian point of view. Please follow us on all social media platforms. Facebook, I have a Facebook group under Reverend Anthony Owens Ministries, and same on Twitter as well as Instagram. You can find us. You also can go to my website, Reverend Anthony Owens.info for info, and you will see information pertaining to our ministry. I pray that you will share my ministry website with your friends, your enemies, and your foes. We are answering questions that many of us have concerning life from a Christian point of view. I thank you for joining us. We will be here every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. To dialogue. I'll be chatting online, and so I pray that you will join us. Thank you so much for watching our ministry video, and may God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.